All right, so today we have South Australian Greens MLC, Rob Sims, in the passenger seat.
Yes.
How you doing, Rob?
Yeah, good, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. We probably should tell our viewers why you're in the passenger seat today.
Yes, well, I don't actually drive. Years ago, back when I was in my early 20s, I started learning to drive, and then I got a job working in Canberra, and the system there is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go through the whole logbook system again. And I came back to Adelaide. I started living in the CBD, and I considered, starting to learn to drive then, but I was living and working in the city, and I thought, I don't really need a car.
Yeah.
And now, 15 years later, I've just never
needed it.
Never needed it.
It's a bit of a luxury not needing a car these days. Myself, I used to live in Amsterdam. They've got amazing bicycle infrastructure over there. I didn't drive once while I was there as well. It was an absolute dream.
But I appreciate you driving me around.
No worries.
Making your exception to the usual rules. Normally you're the person in the passenger seat,
yeah.
So I appreciate it very much.
Not a problem. Yesterday I caught up with you at the Australia Institute Electric Vehicle Day in Adelaide.
Yeah, which was really, really good. Terrific to see so many EV owners there.
Yeah.
And also, I think, some quite exciting developments in terms of, the Labor Party is saying if they're in government that they're going to scrap the EV tax,
yep.
Which of course the Greens opposed in the Parliament. And we've made it clear that if we're in the balance of power in the upper house in the next Parliament, we'll be moving to scrap that tax as well. So
fantastic.
I think that would be a really good outcome. It was pretty embarrassing to see South Australia putting a tax on electric vehicles. I'm very excited about the driverless option on this car. I think it's the kind of car I could get into in the future. It's very smooth, isn't it? I feel like electric cars. They feel very different.
Yeah. So electric motors, they're basically contactless. So there are bearings, but there's not all these moving parts that you have with the internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're very smooth, and there's hardly any wear and tear either. So as a result, you have hardly any maintenance issues. So they're extremely reliable. We were talking earlier about South Australia and how it's really kind of leading Australia in renewables,
yes,
solar and wind.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure I've seen over the last 6 to 12 months that sometimes when there's so much renewable energy being produced in South Australia, that the price actually goes negative, and they're sell electricity to the eastern states. Have you heard of that happening?
Yeah. Look, and there's so many exciting opportunities around solar and renewables. One of the things that we're looking at the moment is there'd been this policy put in place that said that if you put your power back into the grid, if you accumulate more energy, you get a bit of a price discount, and then the federal government have got rid of that.
Oh,
have you
really?
heard about that?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, so that's something that we're looking at the moment. But I think also we need to look at, ensuring that we've got 100% renewables that are actually publicly owned as well.
Yeah.
Because, South Australia had its electricity system privatised many years ago now. And sadly, a lot of the energy providers are, not necessarily operating in the benefits of the citizens. They're about the individual corporations. So that's one of the things we're trying to push for as well, is let's actually have a publicly owned energy provider that it's 100% renewables. A bit like the old ETSA, which South Australian viewers might know about, the Energy Trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a real problem, isn't it? That when these companies get privatised, they eventually become monopolised, and then they're able to crank the prices up, and everyone ends up having to pay a lot more for their electricity. I know South Australia has been at the forefront of implementing some pretty groundbreaking battery projects here. So you had the big battery a few years ago, which is running pretty well now.
We did, which is a really amazing facility. And I mean, one of the things I'd like to look at is what can we do in terms of making that storage capacity available to people in the community more broadly, particularly people that are living in like rental accommodation, for instance, a lot of whom don't get access to renewables. So there's lots of things there that we could do.
So what can be done there? Because what incentives? Obviously, it's much more difficult if you're renting and you've got a landlord. You can't just decide to put a home battery pack in. How can the state government help with those kind of things?
One of the things we've been looking at before is this idea of kind of solar farming, where you put some of the solar panels on the top of city buildings and so on, and allow people to tap into grids.
Oh, yeah.
But also, battery storage, actually giving people the capacity to have small batteries themselves is something that we could be looking at too. So there's lots of things, but really the government needs to step up, I think, and put some money in. And you can't rely on the individual tenant to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
So really, it's not fair to rely on a tenant to make that investment, because ultimately that's actually investment in the home.
In the asset.
That's right, in the asset. So really, it should be about the government stepping in and providing that, or providing incentives for landlords to do it, so that stuff's been put in place.
Yeah, I think like the battery tech, renewables and battery tech, it's just going to make such a profound impact on our cities and our communities, because it's going to enable local communities and households to generate and store their own energy instead of having to rely on these large companies.
Exactly. Yeah.
3, 2, 1.
Oh my God.
Well.
Okay, you've got to do it again on this one. I feel like I'm like in a ride. Oh my God.
You've got instant torque, and there's no wasted energy either. So you'll see as we roll down this hill, see this green line here? That's actually regen braking. So I'm not touching the pedal. That's actually putting energy back into the battery, like recharging the battery. So if you're at the top of a large hill, if you roll down, the battery is actually charging itself on the way down. So you're recovering a lot of that energy. So I'd love to chat to you about how electric vehicles could integrate into our cities and making our cities more bicycle and pedestrian friendly. So as I said, I used to live in Amsterdam, and they've got fantastic bike infrastructure there as well. Yeah, is Adelaide starting to roll out some bike infrastructure?
Well, it's a bit of a sore spot for me. Dan, is I was on the city council prior to going into the state parliament, and there's been this long debate about the east-west bikeway. Incredibly frustrating, because the state government provided some funding to make that happen, and it just basically the council couldn't agree on a route for the bikeway. And separated bike structure in Adelaide has been really controversial. There seems to have frustratingly been a lot of resistance from vested interests mainly, the people who are saying they don't want it on their patch. And it seems to be this kind of false dichotomy between cycling and the economy, and people aren't recognising, you mentioned Amsterdam before, people aren't recognising that actually investing in the cycling infrastructure is really good for local businesses. There's a lot of research that shows that if you have cycling infrastructure in different areas, you're more likely to see, cafes and so on thrive, because there's more opportunities for people to access, rather than just, having to run back to get to their car park. So it's very short-sighted thinking. Really what I'd like to see is a commitment from state government to say, well, look, if we're going to be investing in infrastructure at a local level, roads for instance, well, that cycling needs to be part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about the economic factor. If you've been to central Amsterdam and seen how what a bustling central business district they have in Amsterdam, it's just so economically dynamic there, and it's 70% of people in Amsterdam ride their bikes.
Yeah,
and like if you talk about like a small business, you can fit like two or three cars in front of a cafe or a restaurant or a bar parked out the front, but you can probably fit like 20 bicycles in front of this in the same space. So you can attract a lot more people to local areas using, if you've got good bike infrastructure. And I remember in Amsterdam, it's so safe there that like 10-year-old kids can ride their bikes to school in the middle of the city. And I remember thinking, like, because I grew up in a country town in central Queensland, I used to ride my bike to school as well. But there's no way kids can do that in our cities here anymore. I'm sure they used to be able to, but if we had proper bike infrastructure, there's no reason why we couldn't make our streets safe enough to do that.
Yeah, that's right. But there's a whole heap of things in that regard that I think are really short-sighted. In South Australia, it's kind of like our roads are just there for cars, rather than, looking at things like cycling infrastructure, but also speed limits. I mean, we really should be reducing speed limits around the CBD. That would instantly, protect people in terms of risk of death and so on. So there's lots and lots of things that could be done. But again, we're not seeing the leadership.
Yeah, right.
Leadership from the government to make that happen. But yeah, cycling is it's incredibly frustrating to see the way that issue has been politicised. And one of the things we've been pushing is to have a cycling and walking commissioner, so an active transport commissioner.
Okay.
And they've had this model over in the UK that would really act as a bit of a circuit breaker and encourage policy change in that area. And I think that would be really, really good. Because it takes the politics out of it. Actually you've got an expert that can say this is what we need to do and how we're going to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I saw that, like, since COVID, Paris has had a massive uptake of commuter cyclists.
Yeah. Well, so many cities around the world have been, doing pop-up bikeways and so on, but we haven't done anything like that here in South Australia. And Adelaide, as a city council, I think has really dropped the ball on that. So it's very frustrating.
You've actually worked at all three levels of government. You've worked at a council level, state level, and federal level. You're currently at the state level, which is pretty unique. There mustn't be many people who've had the experience of working at all three levels of government.
No, I think that's true. I feel very lucky to have had that opportunity. It sort of gives you a bit of an insight into how to get things done. Yeah. And each level of government is very different. I always joke to friends, I want to go to the UN next.
Oh, right.
That's the next goal, No, not really. I'm actually very happy in state politics.
Yeah.
I think, obviously at a federal level you deal with the big picture issues often, the big kind of national priorities. But one of the great things about state politics is it's very tangible and you can actually get things done. And, South Australia has had a great manufacturing base and I think a really proud history of that. And it's all been lost because we don't have car manufacturing here anymore. So that's something I'd really like to look at. Let's bring back car manufacturing, but let's actually do it for electric cars.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there was a car manufacturing here years ago, and we had all those skills. Yeah. All that engineering knowledge, practical knowledge, factory workers, and all the support industries that come with it. And I'm sure a lot of that knowledge is still there, but we really need to build that back up again, because it's such an asset and it has a big impact on the rest of the economy as well.
It does, and I feel like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry globally. Why isn't South Australia getting a piece of the action?
Yeah. Have you been following the COP26 over the last week?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think Greta sums it up, doesn't she? The blah 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 fest.
Nothing motivates you like a goal that's 29 years away. Huh?
I know.
It's just crazy, and you look at their so-called plan that they came out with, and I mean, it took 5 minutes to look at that and realise that it was completely fraudulent. Like, first of all, the government's claiming to have Australia's emissions have dropped by 20% since 2005, and we know that actually that is completely misleading, because that's based on avoided deforestation, not actual emissions cuts. So that 20%, it's not really a 20% reduction in the burning of fossil fuels. They stopped cutting down trees, basically. And then they talk a lot about this technology, not taxes thing. But the technology that they're talking about, carbon capture and storage, it doesn't work.
No.
Right? And all it does is enable coal and gas companies to continue burning fossil fuels.
It's just the master of spin, really.
Yeah.
And that sums Morrison up. I mean, he's just a marketing person. But the ultimate hollow man, really. I just don't know what he stands for.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the world leaders have cottoned onto that, and the international press as well. And they have. I think a lot of these misleading things have been exposed over the last week. On the positive side, seeing those protests outside of the conference, I think they had 100,000 people there yesterday. And Greta had an amazing speech as well on Saturday. So I think the climate movement in general is still building, and I think that's a positive thing. Regardless of what they're doing there, the climate movement continues to grow.
I agree, and I think fundamentally, yes, it's the parliament that makes the laws, but it's the community that drives the social change, and the power rests with us as citizens. I think we have to demand better from our politicians. It's interesting. I spoke at a rally on the steps of Parliament House on Saturday, and there was a good turnout here locally, calling for more leadership from world leaders around this. So I get a sense people are wising up, particularly here in Australia. We're so conscious of the impacts of climate. In South Australia, we're going to be really significantly impacted.
Yeah, and you had some horrible bushfires here.
Yeah.
Kangaroo Island, 50%
Exactly.
of Kangaroo Island was burnt.
It's just
right?
horrendous. I'm going there this week, actually, on Wednesday, to spend some time there looking at the impact of the bushfires and the recovery efforts and so on. But I think we've really got to do something, and we need the federal government to be stepping up to the plate.
Yeah, I mean, it is positive to see some states are starting to move ahead of the federal government.
Yes.
We've seen New South Wales that even though it's a Liberal government, New South Wales, they seem to be moving faster than the federal government, like people like Matt Keane, for example.
And the thing is too, we talk a lot about the global response to COVID and the fact that everybody's worked together to try and address this. And we've all taken quite radical action, in terms of dealing with COVID, social distancing,
listening
masks.
to the science.
That's right, following the science, following the evidence, not being able to see loved ones and so on. I actually think COVID-19 will be the curtain raiser for climate change in terms of the disruption. Because that's a really huge potential disruptor if we don't do something about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Like, we've seen that governments around the world have acted on the science with COVID. We've seen that coordinated response, and we know that we can act in those ways. We know that countries can fully vaccinate within 6 to 12 months. And so we need to do the same now with the climate crisis. We need a coordinated response. We need to get serious, and we need to treat it like the crisis that it is. Really.
Yeah, exactly. Listen to the experts.
Yeah.
And sometimes experts give difficult advice or say things you don't want to hear. I'm sure we all would rather not be in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
But this is the world in which we live.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of lessons for us in terms of the response to COVID that we could take going forward dealing with climate.
Yeah. And I think a lot of certain politicians, they try to frame action on climate as a burden, and they say, it's going to cost. What's it going to cost? And it's going to take 10 years, or it's going to take 20 years. But really, there's so many positives with the transition, and we're sitting in one of them right now.
Yeah.
Like, electric vehicles are going to be amazing for our society. We're going to not only are we going to reduce our emissions dramatically with electric vehicles, but we're going to reduce the amount of diesel and petrol exhaust pollution that's in our cities.
That's right.
Which is going to have huge health benefits for everyone. Someone like yourself who doesn't drive, but you walk to work, you're probably exposed to a lot of diesel particulate in the city.
Yeah.
And now when we get to 100% electric vehicles, we're going to have pure clean air in our cities. Like, it's going to be amazing.
Yeah. There's some really exciting opportunities around how we transition to the next phase.
Yeah.
There's a book I read years ago on the environmental crisis. I've forgotten the name of it. I'll look it up and send it to you. But it talked about the fact that climate is often framed as a catastrophe, and when we talk about it in that way, it's quite disempowering for people. And it gave the analogy of, Martin Luther King talked about, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Motivate people with talking about the opportunity that can lie ahead. That's not to say we shouldn't also talk about the catastrophe that's there if we don't take action.
Yeah.
Because I think that's an important part of the story.
Yeah.
But I think for us in the environmental movement, talking about some of the opportunities, like the jobs that can flow from green manufacturing and so on, improve community health and well-being, more tree planting, what that means, not just in terms of responding to climate and keeping streets cooler and so on, but also there's a lot of research that shows that improves community health, mental health, when you've got more trees and greenery around.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's about telling that part of the story too, I think.
Yeah, greening our cities, more active transport. And another thing that often isn't discussed is that when we really start to see a massive uptake of renewable energy, our energy prices are going to come down dramatically as well. I read a couple of weeks ago that in Norway, they get a lot of their energy from hydro, but they get a lot of it from wind as well in the North Sea. And there was a huge amount of wind energy coming into Norway from the North Sea, and it dropped the spot price so much. It was something like 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour. And a guy who owns a Tesla Model 3 like this one, he tweeted saying that he had actually fully charged his car for 10 cents. And that's like a 400 kilometer range. So that's the abundance of energy that we can potentially have with when we get really serious about renewable energy.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
But you know who doesn't want that? The coal, oil and gas.
Of course.
companies.
Well, that's right. Absolutely. They'll do anything they can to try and lock us into the status quo.
Exactly.
And the other thing that we haven't really talked about, but is the kind of nexus between all this stuff and the bankrolling of political parties by the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. So what's happening there? Are banks finally starting to pull out, or are there still banks that are?
Oh, they are. I think some are. I think businesses could do more in terms of divestment.
Mm-hmm.
But also, though, we've got the fossil fuel industry, financing so many of our political parties.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And something that we've been calling for in the Greens is to say, well, let's take fossil fuels out of...
Yeah. Don't they donate, a lot of... I think I read that, Santos and Woodside, they don't actually donate to both sides of politics.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And, we don't take donations from those companies in the Greens or from developers. And, I really think they should be kept out of our political process as well.
Yeah. Well, it seems like they get pretty good bang for their buck, because I think, the coal, well, at least the coal industry gets around 10 billion in subsidies each year.
Yep, and at a federal level, they're getting a climate policy that's a sort of do nothing.
Status quo.
They get good value for money.